All right, let me go ahead and say I appreciate those who are joining. I know we have a few people already because we already have a few comments coming in through YouTube. So I'll give my greetings to Nick and Eli who are already there waiting on us. And for anybody else who happens to be watching or waiting already, I am noting, oh, there it is. I was gonna say my little icon that tells me how many people are watching wasn't visible on my screen, but it finally popped up. But it's not right. I've had a problem with that lately that it doesn't actually tell me anything. It just says zero even when I've got 15 people commenting at the same time. So it's there, but it doesn't do anything for me. But anyways, if you're here, I appreciate you joining. We'll give just a second for more people to join in and be a part of this. We're going to try to keep things running pretty smoothly tonight because we have the first question, as we were talking about before. The first question I think allows for a lot of place of discussion. The second question is more so to build upon what's said in the first one and emphasize points I think will already be established to tie things up nice and neatly. So let me go ahead then and introduce the men who are joining me. So we have in the middle, we have Brother Abraham Kline. Brother Kline is a preacher in Pennsylvania, and he does pulpit supply and whatever other kind of work he can help to do in the ministry. I know you have several different things you do there, local ministries, and so I appreciate that. I've known Brother Kline for a while, and then we've also been praying for him for a while because he's had some different health concerns throughout his life. So we're glad to see the Lord blessing and helping in a lot of that. Then, of course, anybody who's watched these before will be no stranger to Brother Jesse Hailey, that Brother Hailey, who, as we've said many times, we're not blood related except through the blood of Christ, is a good friend of mine, also a Macedonian missionary serving in South Dakota, has done a great job there. I know when I first joined Macedonia, you had already planted one church, from what I understand, and was working on the second one, and the second one's come along really well. I know you aren't even in the same building you were when I was there. You've already got a bigger building. So that's a blessing to see the work going there and how the Lord's blessing that and using you. I appreciate these two fellows taking the time to join us. We're going to be looking at questions concerning the subject of self-defense tonight, because hopefully people will ask questions, because this is a subject that a lot of people have a lot of questions on. It's one that I guess is considered to be a little more sensitive or touchy in some ways. But we're happy to take those questions and to discuss those. We're going to look at it entirely from a biblical perspective. We're not interested in personal opinions and so forth. So we're going to look at this from the Bible and see what God says about self-defense. And through that, it's going to allow us the opportunity to address the question of what does it mean then when God talks about doing good to those who do evil and heaping coals upon their head. So to simplify that question, I'm just going to ask, what does it mean to heap coals on someone's head in the biblical sense, not the literal sense? But our first question then is going to be, is self-defense okay? Speaking biblically, is self-defense okay? And so Brother Hailey's going to be answering this question. I'm going to go ahead and turn that over to him then for him to answer this question for you. Is self-defense okay?
Okay, well, it's good to be with you again, and this is a tough subject. It's more than just a yes or no question or yes or no answer, but just to kind of lay the groundwork a little bit, trying to look at the questions along the lines of, is it right to employ lethal force to protect the life of yourself and others? Because in the self-defense, I'm thinking of not only, I think that would fall into the category of, the cases where we've had people carrying a handgun in church, and then a shooter come in, and then that guy take out the shooter. Is that okay? And I believe that falls under the category of self-defense as well. Is it right to take measures that might kill an attacker who is wrongfully threatening your life or the life of another? Self-defense is defined as protecting oneself from injury at the hand of others. Self-defense is not about taking vengeance. Self-defense is not about punishing criminals. Self-defense involves preserving one's own health and life when it is threatened by the actions of others. When we speak about using potential lethal force in self-defense, we're talking about, again, using weapons, not, which kind of is another layer to it, I suppose, when the outcome could be our attacker being hurt or killed ultimately. So I think I'll start by just saying in my study, and if you study this, what you'll find out is that self-defense is a principle throughout the Bible, going all the way back to the book of Exodus. And that's where I'm going to start here in the book of Exodus when the Lord is giving the law. And then, well, we know for one thing, the Bible God values life. You know, we talk about the sanctity of human life. So that obviously plays into it. I think about one of the 10 commandments, Exodus 20:13, thou shalt not kill. And of course, we understand that the context of that kill is murder, because later on, or even before that, God said in Genesis 9 that if a man basically murder another person, then by man shall his blood be shed. So, you know, I'm not trying to go down the military route and the death sentence route and all that stuff, but there's connotations to that. But I'll get to Exodus 22, verses 2 through 3. And this says that if a thief be found breaking up and be smitten that he die, then shall no blood be shed for him. If the sun be risen upon him, there shall be blood shed for him, for he should make full restitution. If he have nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. So basically the idea here in Exodus 22 is this guy's breaking in your house in the middle of the night. And God is saying, basically, if you in self-defense, you don't know this guy's motives. Is he just trying to steal something? Is he there to kill, rape? What is he there to do? So if you kill this man in the night, not knowing what he's there to do, the Bible says there'll be no blood required for it. So in other words, that person, that homeowner, which is another biblical principle of private property, but that homeowner won't be guilty. But it says if the sun be risen upon him, and then there's bloodshed. In other words, if you find out and you look out and, hey, that's the guy that was in our house last night, you go after him, well, there's a problem with that. That's not self-defense. Self-defense is this guy's coming in, threatening my... So being presented here in Exodus 22 is fairly clearly outlined that if somebody breaks in your house and under this principle, middle of the night, you don't know what's going on, you've got a right to defend yourself. If the guy dies, that blood, you will not be held accountable to that, according to this verse in Exodus 22. And now I do want to make the distinction a little bit here that I'm starting off by dealing with some of these Old Testament principles. It's when we get to the New Testament that we start finding some difficult passages that challenge, because I think there's a principle of self-defense throughout the Bible. When you get to the New Testament is when you find some verses that, kind of challenge this a little bit. But I'll just give a couple more Old Testament examples. Nehemiah is a pretty classic example. Nehemiah 4:13, therefore I set in the lower places behind the wall, and on the higher places I even set people after their families with their swords and their spears and their bows. So Nehemiah was arming these men as they worked on the wall. And again, the next verse says, remember the Lord, which is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. And literally, they had enemies that were threatening them from the outside. So what Nehemiah says is, hey, get your swords, get your spears, get your bows, fight for your families, defend your families if it comes to it. Self-defense. So it's very difficult to argue against self-defense throughout these passages that we're dealing with in the Old Testament. Nehemiah 4:17, there again in Nehemiah 4, but it says, they which build the wall, they bear burdens with those that laid it, every man with one of his hands wrought in the work, and with the other hand on a weapon. So we see that these people had weapons, and those weapons were there for the purpose of self-defense. The last Old Testament passage I'll give, just showing that God clearly was okay, and according to Exodus 22 shows that he was fine with self-defense. Nehemiah, to me, confirms that. Esther is another example. Esther 8, verses 11 through 12, the Bible says, wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together and stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and the province that would assault them. So up to this point, arguing self-defense is very, very difficult. So it is a biblical principle. So if just to put it in context, I believe from the beginning, God's been fine with self-defense. God has, at the very least said it's okay. Again, in Exodus 22, made it clear that, hey, if that's what happens, that's what happens. As far as the death of a man that would break into the house, you not knowing his motives in the middle of the night. So just imagine when Jesus comes on the scene, that's already an accepted rule among the Jews, among God's people, is, okay, we can defend ourselves. We can carry our sword. We can carry weapons. We're not carrying weapons just to hunt. We're carrying weapons for the purpose of defending ourselves. So when Jesus is born, that is the way it is with God's people, the accepted norm among God's people. But then, of course, Jesus comes along, and that's where you get into the passages that cause confusion, because if you disagree with me, I'm sure you're sitting there saying, wait a second, how can you say that, self-defense is okay when Jesus said, Matthew 5:39, the most common verse and passage that's used is Jesus saying, but I say unto you that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And then another verse, 1 Timothy 5:8, but if any provide not for his own, and especially of those of his own house, nope, that's not the verse I was looking for. Sorry, I had the verse that return no man evil for evil, render no man evil for evil. But the point is those verses can present. That's where the questions come up. However, I believe when we look in the Garden of Gethsemane is the place that we will go now. In Luke 22, this is when, or leading up to the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus said in Luke 22, verse 36, then said he unto them, but now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise his scrip. And he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say unto you that this is written must be yet accomplished in me. And he was reckoned among the transgressors. For the things concerning me have an end. They said unto him, Lord, here are 2 swords. And he said unto them, it is enough. And he came out and went as he was wont in the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. So it's difficult just based on this interaction. Jesus saying, sell what you have and go buy swords. Hey, do you guys have swords? Now remember, understand the principle that's going on here. These guys by this point have already been walking with Jesus for over 3 years. And at least 2 of them were carrying swords, and Jesus was okay with that. Jesus knew that. These guys are carrying their weapons to a prayer meeting. These guys are carrying their weapons everywhere they're going. They have 2 of them among the group. They're not an army that's out, fighting people, but they do have 2 swords, and Jesus said that's enough. So it's difficult to make absolute claims beyond these observations, but the observations themselves, I believe, have significance. Namely, among those closest to Jesus, some carried personal weapons. Jesus never condemned that. They carried him in his presence. They carried him with him as he ministered and worked and preached and so forth. Communion, prayer meetings, you name it. So we cannot make absolute claims as to the reasons, right or wrong, for carrying these weapons. Perhaps it was in anticipation of trouble from Jewish leadership. Perhaps it was protection from robbers and things of that nature. Though these questions we can't answer for sure, we do know that they possessed weapons. They were carrying swords, that they carried these weapons, and that Jesus knew and consented to them carrying these weapons. So to me, that's significant. Furthermore, Jesus spoke of some time, either present or in the future, when the disciples would need to acquire personal weapons, even more urgently than garments. Then one more passage from the Gospels I'll share, and then one out of the epistles. But Matthew 26, 51 through 52, and behold, one of them which were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck a servant of the high priest and smote off his ear. Then said Jesus unto him, put up again thy sword into his place. For all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. Thus the famous saying, they that live by the sword shall die by the sword. Though we see sanction and even a qualified directive from Christ to possess personal weapons, in this regard, Jesus said, put the sword away. And again, the points that I'm sharing with you are about the extent of weapons. There's a couple more times it's alluded to, if you bring soldiers or law enforcement into it, there's other verses there about that. But as far as self-defense, this is kind of all we have. But the emphasis on the remainder of the New Testament is decidedly not geared toward issues of physical self-defense or righteous use of lethal force. Rather, we see more of an emphasis on godly living, suffering affliction, suffering persecution for Christ, grasping the doctrines of Christ and the gospel, and so there's a couple of those things. There's somewhere where I guess I'd close, not totally close, but get to closing with this. Possession of weapons and acquiring skill in using them in self-defense is permitted in Scripture, but not required. The issue, just think again here with Jesus. He said, Peter, number one, he said, do you have swords? 2 of you got them? Good, that's enough. And then he told him, hey, there's going to be a time where you need to buy swords more than you need to buy garments. But then he told Peter, of course, hey, no, this isn't the time to use the sword. And he didn't say, hey, Peter, get rid of the sword. What are you doing? He didn't say get rid of it. He said, just put it back in the sheath. Just put it back on your side. This is not the time to use the sword. So as difficult as this question is, where I come down on it, or where I believe the Bible's coming down on it, is, again, it's difficult. There's debatable areas within it. But it seems that when it comes for standing for the faith, preaching the faith, being persecuted as Christians, that we suffer as Christians, that we endure that suffering. If somebody, the government comes into the church and tries to shut the church down, we don't just say, hey, man, let's take up arms, the Branch Davidians or whatever, and we're going to fight these guys off. As Americans, we have that right. But again, as scripturally speaking, that seems to be a place within the spiritual realm, because remember, spiritually speaking, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're spiritual. However, the verse I shared earlier, and I'll maybe be the last verse I'll use for now, 1 Timothy 5:8. But if any provide not for his own, and specifically of those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. And I know that's specifically talking about providing food and shelter, but I believe I believe, and again, you could disagree with me on this, but I believe a part of that verse is protection for our family in regards to those that would just do us harm in a civil, not over a spiritual issue, but over a civil issue, that we do have a right, biblically speaking, to defend ourselves. We are not told that we have to, but we have a right to. And then just one last thing I want to address on the turn the other cheek verse. That seems to be, if you think about the implication of turning the other cheek, if somebody smites you on the cheek, if somebody smacks you in the face, so what? What is that harming? Getting slapped on the face hurts your pride. Getting slapped on your face is an insult. Generally speaking, there's not much more comes to it than that. So turn to them the other. So I believe one of the things the Lord is saying and teaching in that is that does not fall into the category of us needing to defend ourselves. We need to learn to take wrong when all it is maybe it's a little humiliating or embarrassing, or it hurt our pride what somebody said or does to us, and that we don't have to fight back for the sake of our pride or something. It's just words. I've been in situations where I've had people act like they wanted me to defend them because this person, what they were saying, and I'm like, they're talking. So what? Words are words, and we know there's power in words, but there's no physical response needed, as far as I'm concerned, from words that people are saying. So anyway, just something to, again, it's a tough question. I feel like I stammered and stuttered there a little bit trying to get to it, but that's what I've got.
No, I appreciate especially bringing out that with the Old Testament law, because I think one place where we fail a lot of times is that we neglect the Old Testament law, failing to understand that you have to understand division for ceremonial law and civil law. But when it comes to laws of morality, it still teaches you what God's idea of morality is. So even though that would fall, like I say, under civil law in terms of how their government was to function, it still shows you God's perspective of self-defense. And that's a proper use of that passage. Whereas, again, a lot of people, just like the passage in Matthew 5, a lot of people try to write it off because, well, it's for this purpose, and so they try to write it out the way. I do appreciate that you brought pride as part of the discussion, because I do think that that's where we struggle a lot of times with these verses, is that we get offended at the idea of God asking us to just take it. And it is a matter of pride in that regard. And I do agree that it is a complicated question. That's something we were discussing before, as I believe it's a complicated question because it's a layered question. I do think the simple answer in terms of, is self-defense allowed, biblically speaking, I think there's a resounding yes, it's allowed. But is it always the right thing to do is the question really that's at the heart of this, I think. And that's actually, for me, this is where some people may disagree with me on what I see Matthew 5 as being about. So I'm actually going to go back and reread the passage. I think you read most of what I wanted already, or at least you've quoted and mentioned it, but I actually want to read verse 38 to verse 42. It says, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if a man will sue thee at law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. Give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not thou away." Now, what I look at in this passage, and I think this is where some people struggle in interpreting it and make it more complicated than it has to be, is even just the other day, I didn't call them out or correct them or disagree with them because it wasn't what we were discussing, but somebody tried to write off this passage in one of the Q&As recently. I don't remember who it was now, but they tried to write off this passage of Matthew 5 because they said it's for the millennium. And sure, if you believe that's what it applies to, it's fine. But I do believe that the principle of what's being taught is something that we need to take right now. Mm-hmm. Because what I see Jesus doing throughout this passage, not just here, but over and over again throughout Matthew 5, is he takes something that is either part of Old Testament law, or like in the next step, he takes something that's tradition, but not necessarily law. It's actually a twisting of law, this idea of love your neighbor and hate your enemy. That's not biblical. That's something that they took Old Testament verses and mashed two verses together and twist them and disfigured them to make them say that. And he's taking these things and he's skewering them in the sense that he's showing them that they failed to get the whole point. And I think the fact that he calls in this law of an eye for an eye plainly teaches that. As anybody who's listening from my church will have heard me talk about before, the law for an eye is a very simple law. It actually is part of a series of laws that are there for the purpose of establishing the value of a human life. In this case, that of an infant, of a baby that's not yet been born. And so in this case, what he's doing is he's creating a law that says that if my wife is pregnant and two men are fighting and one of them bumps into her and causes a problem with the baby, then when the baby is born, if the baby has a problem in the eye, then I can have a problem with that man's eye afflicted to him. It's an eye for an eye, life for life, so forth. Whatever he afflicts, I can have the equal portion of that afflicted on him. And the Jews walk away from that with the mentality, and this is something we as modern day Christians are guilty of too. They walk away from that with the mentality that my right is that if you hurt my baby, I can hurt you. That's my right. Sure, that's right. That is your right. But the whole point of that law was not necessarily to define your right, but to define the value of that life. And you see that if you look at the context, because the law, I believe, prior to that is the law concerning that if you have an animal, specifically an ox, that is known for goring people or hurting people, if somebody gets killed, if it's not known for doing that, if it's the first time, then the animal's killed and you pay some money or whatever, and it's fine. Because you didn't knowingly let the animal kill somebody. But that's establishing that the value of a human life will always exceed that of the animal. But then in that same law, he explains that if you knew the animal was likely to do this and that animal then kills somebody, then you're a murderer. The animal was a weapon in your hand, essentially, because you knew that, because you put the value of your profit or your animal or whatever above that of a human life. Then even the law after the eye for an eye, is concerning the idea of owning slaves, and it's talking about the fact that they're people and they're not property. You have to treat them as people. That if you have someone who is a servant to you, they're a servant, not the slave in the traditional sense, is the way the world thinks of it. That you treat them kindly, and if you hurt them, you can be hurt in return for that. And so you notice that God's taking these things that we still, this is why I love the beauty and the relevance of that law, is God's taking these things that governments today are struggling to understand. Is a baby a life? A baby in the womb, is it life? Well, yes, it is. It's equal, and the value of its life is worth as much as yours. Is an animal's life worth as much as a human? No, it's not. Is someone who you count as a servant or a slave, if that's allowed within your society, can you treat them as property? Well, no, because all human life is precious and valuable. So you think about a topic that's relevant today. I don't know of any topic that's being debated more than that one topic right now. So I know I've said a whole lot that seems like it has nothing to do with this, but this is just setting up my belief of what this passage is really about when he says turn the other cheek. The point he's making is that legally, do you have the right to ask an eye for an eye? Sure. Do you have legally the right to defend yourself? Absolutely. As tremendously was shown, you have that according to the law. But just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And that's what he's getting them to understand in this. It's just because I have the right that if you do something to me, I can hit you right back, doesn't mean that that's what is the right thing to react in that situation and at all times. That's why, of course, again, follows it up with the idea that if somebody takes me to court, well, if we're in court, then I have legal rights. I mean, that's why we're in court. If somebody's taking me to court and they're suing me for my jacket, then okay. Is it just because I have the right to fight them, does it mean that I need to fight them right now? If it's better, if the greater good, because even if you continue reading, the next context is about the greater good. It's about loving others equal with yourself, and about not resisting evil and so forth. The idea is that sometimes it's better for me to suffer for the greater good. And I think that was a point you were making as well. So I don't think there's any disagreement to what you were saying, but I wanted to bring that out. And I have several layers that I want to peel back about this, but one of them I wanted to deal with right out the gate is understanding that a lot of the passages that we struggle with in the New Testament and ask the question, is self-defense allowed? In many ways, it's a misunderstanding that it's not that God's saying self-defense is never allowed, that you just always have to turn the other cheek. It's a matter of stepping back and asking, just because I'm allowed to defend myself, is it the right time? Is it right for me to do it? Will this bring the greater good? I'll give an example that my sister-in-law was hit by a car riding her bicycle, which in Belgium is very common. So it sounds bad to all those people in America, but here this is Tuesday. She got hit by 2 cars in 1 year. But anyways, the first one that hit her, because of some issues with insurance, she didn't pursue her legal right to force him to pay for all the bills because she was trying to find an alternative way, because she was more concerned with that person's soul. Her greater concern was whether or not that person would get the gospel. So she was willing to suffer a little bit if that meant that I don't automatically shut the door to the gospel because I exercise my legal rights. And I believe that's exactly what this passage is about. That sometimes I need to turn the other cheek because it allows me the opportunity to be a witness. And there's where we can start peeling back some layers about what are those times in a moment. But I want to bring Brother Kline in. I want him to leave him over there in the corner for too long. So, you got anything you want to add in on that before I start peeling back some of the layers I have written down?
Some layers, yeah. I was actually thinking about what Brother Hailey, other Brother Hailey, had said in Exodus 22 about the idea of a man coming into your home. If it's in the night, you have no idea what his motive is and things like that. You have the right to defend yourself. But if you see him later, it's not. That's no longer defense. And I guess in many ways that just goes around with the way the laws are anyway. It's your right to defend yourself in the heat of the moment, but it's not your job to seek vengeance on that person when you see them later. And Romans chapter 12 actually talks about it. Also talks about so Romans chapter 12 says, recompense to no man evil for evil, provide things honest in the sight of all men, if it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. So, although it's all right maybe to defend ourselves when someone's coming against us, it's not all right to necessarily just try to seek vengeance on them, because, first of all, that's not the way the law works. We're not allowed to be mavericks, so to speak. And the Bible shows
vengeance
that.
is clearly God. In fact, we take it ourselves, we're stealing from him. I'm sorry, Brother Hailey.
No, I was just going to say I really appreciate you bringing in the passage there out of Romans 12. I meant to get to the vengeance part too, because I alluded to it, but I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah.
But I really wished I had included the verse that you did, so I'm so thankful that you put in there, recompense, evil for, whatever. But then when it gets down to, if possible, live peaceably with all men, and I think that kind of, that's a pretty big key that I did not include, but so I really appreciate you including that. I think it's a really important passage on the subject.
Well, that thought is certainly a pivot within what we're discussing in terms of, is it legally allowed and is it right? Because those are two very different things. There's a lot of things that I'm legally allowed to do that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do. Just because even God's law in this regard is, I believe, the point that just because I'm legally allowed to require an eye for an eye in terms of God's law doesn't mean that it's the right thing for me to always do. It's kind of like the idea, when the family of someone who's been murdered seeks mercy for the person who's going to receive the death penalty. It's the same principle behind that they're looking at it, that his life is valuable, and they want to show him mercy and hope that by showing him mercy, they can save his life, not just in the sense of saving him from the death penalty, but also pulling him back from that dark place he's at. Now, some of the things I have written down that I think are important to consider in this is one thing you have to regard in asking the question is, just because I have the right to do it, is it the right thing to do? Is in regards to suffering for righteousness. So this is more pertaining to governments. You'll notice almost every verse, like even what Brother Kline was just mentioning, the verses I'm about to mention, all of these are talking about suffering at the hand of a government. And even were written to churches who were suffering at the hands of government. So, these weren't vain, empty things that God was asking. The people they're being told to are going through far worse than what any of us will probably ever go through at the hand of any kind of government. But I want to go to 1 Peter 2, verse 20 through verse 24. It says, for what glory is it if, when ye be buffeted for your fault, ye shall take it patiently? But if, when ye do well and suffer for it, ye take it patiently, this is acceptable with God. For even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that ye should follow his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously, who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we being dead to sin should live unto righteousness, by whose stripes ye were healed. For ye were as sheep going astray, but now are returned, returned unto the shepherd and bishop of your souls. And I think that's a very important passage in peeling the layers and seeing, okay, when is it just because I have the right, is it still right? Is looking at this example that Christ, when it was for the necessity of others, was willing to suffer and revile. I mean, we know that he stood before the judge. I mean, he went to court, and he didn't defend himself. At any moment, he could open his mouth and defend himself, but he stood before Pontius Pilate and never said a word to defend himself. At every moment and every step of the way, he never took any step he could have to stop the suffering. We know that even Pilate agreed that I find no fault in this man. They saw nothing in him that he should be crucified. And so every step of that, we see that he was suffering for righteousness, but it's because he considered the product of that to be far more worthy than his rights, his cause, so to speak. And I think that's one of the very first most important things we have to understand in asking the question of, is it a time for defense? And you'll notice in church history, this is the time where Christians have always opted to take it, to suffer. Is when it comes to let's say the greater good, when it comes to suffering for righteousness. If the government's going to burn me at the stake because I refuse to let go of my Bible, I'm going to still preach my Bible. I'm still, if I have to be put in a lion's den because I'm praying, I'm still going to go to the lion's den. I'm not going to fight back. And this is actually something, that Brother Hailey was dealing with in the last part of your statement. So I think you were already going that way. You just ran out of time on it. That when it comes to the one place where it's absolutely clear that it's better to let your rights go to the wayside and take it, is when it comes to being persecuted for righteousness, and especially in this cause, when it comes to the government persecuting us. I don't want to hog the time to talk, but I've mentioned this so many times that where we're at, where I'm at in the world here in Belgium and just below the Netherlands, this is where religious freedom come from. And it wasn't because people charged the government and took over and killed the kings and all that kind of stuff. It's because preachers went and were burned on the stake, not century, long time ago. I'm talking about just a couple hundred years ago, just 300 years ago. They were still burning preachers at the stake in the Dom Square outside of the King's Palace in Amsterdam. 300 to 400 years ago, you see that. You stand there today and can just imagine those preachers there. But that is what moved the hearts of the people, and through moving the hearts of the people, that's what moved the hearts of the government. And I think that also comes down to a central issue of Christianity, that our main focus is reaching the heart of people. That's why, I don't want to get into politics today, but that's why we always remember that our main goal is to reach people.
But that even kind of goes, even if you look historically, say 50 years ago, when there was a lot of issues in the United States regarding preachers having to get a license, or churches having to become incorporated and different things like that. They kept doing what they were doing, but when the police came or when court orders came, they just took it. They were willing to go to jail. Yeah, they, by going to church and stuff like that, without their license and stuff like that, they were protesting, but they were not. When it came time to actually, they submitted, and they did. And in many ways, I believe that helped get us to where we eventually got to where we had those rights.
No, I agree with that. And that's why, like I say, I think that's one of the first things you have to peel back. I think a second layer to be peeled back, and I don't want to cut in case Brother Hailey wanted to throw something in on that before I go to the next layer, but okay. All right. The second layer, I would say, is one I've already dealt with, and that's right versus rights. And I really only have one verse I want to throw out in consideration that I haven't already, and that would be Psalm 9:4. And Psalm 9:4, David speaks to the idea that thou hast defended my right and my cause. And so this actually even brings me to my final layer I would like to peel back. He says in Psalm 9:4, for thou hast maintained my right and my cause, thou sattest in the throne judging right. So all of that leads me, my final layer, I'll go ahead and say it, I'll give verses in a little while, is that even if we do take principles for self-defense, we do have to remember in the end that our trust needs to be in God. I think that should always be the priority.
Yeah.
But as far as the second layer, just in case I didn't define that well, that was the point I was bringing out when I read Matthew 5, is that we understand that just because something is right doesn't mean it's always our job to fight for our rights. Sometimes we have to trust God with those. Sometimes we have to realize that He's the judge and He's in charge of that. But again, though, as been clearly illustrated, that doesn't mean that there's never a time. It just means that there are times where we have to learn to trust God with our right and our cause.
I think there's a good deal too, to where that we as Christians don't get a victim type mentality. I think that hurts like anybody's cause if you're trying to be a victim all the time. But for Christians that take everything so personally and take everything as if they're a persecuted victim, versus like keeping a good attitude and being strong in our faith and loving and caring in those that we may be dealing with. So I think that kind of ties in a little bit too.
No, I agree with that. And I would say it's probably a place where we're going to struggle and where everybody's going to find different levels of where they feel is the point to fight and not on that. And I think coronavirus is probably one of the best examples of that when they started shutting down churches, is that you want to see a fast division. I had friends who were championing the fact that I stayed open when the government said close, and I had other friends who were telling me, or who were sending me messages every 5 minutes to tell me that I'm wrong and I'm out of the will of God for not shutting down. I had one man go as far as to tell me that I'm going to see my son in the grave if I don't close my church.
Oh, my goodness.
So I saw every spectrum of response to the fact that when the government said you have to close your church because coronavirus, but now the government, we didn't protest. I mean, we didn't. It's kind of like what Brother Kline said. We peacefully protested, I guess, in the sense that we were respectful. We put out sanitizer. We disinfected between services. We supplied masks. We separated seats by 1.5 meters. We limited the number. I preached 3 and 4 messages sometimes on Sunday just to limit the number of people enough to get it down to what was a reasonable number and still get everybody through on Sunday. So, we did everything we could to be reasonable. And that, I think this falls under that, and I'm glad. That's why I say it's such a good pivotal verse. I agree with you, to live peaceably as much as possible.
We don't have a chip on our, we don't have a chip on our shoulder.
Yeah.
And I think there's some Christians that do, but I'm just saying that ought not be the way.
Yeah.
But I just give the example with the coronavirus things. I think that's just a tremendous example that we all just went through. And here in Belgium, we're getting ready to go through it a second time. That's why I say the government agrees with us this time, that they shut down all the bars and restaurants and amusement parks, but they left the churches alone for now. So they agree that, Constitution does say that they can't stop us from meeting. It's just the first time they didn't agree. But, over time, because we didn't go out and behave like a bunch of rebels, we just let God defend our right and our cause. God did. That doesn't mean they won't shut us down again, but at least this time we weren't the first thing that they shut down and the last thing they wanted to open. This time they're trying not to attack us. So God has certainly went to bat for us. God certainly went and fought for us.
Yeah.
But that's the layer there, and then the final layer for me, and you guys may have plenty of other thoughts, but for me, the final layer that has to be peeled back in determining that just because I have the right, and if anybody's bothered, I know you guys aren't, but if anybody watching is bothered by the fact that I haven't debated more, or discussed more about do we have the rights, because I think Brother Hailey perfectly showed that we do. There's nothing for me to add to that. Now I'm discussing when is it right to do it just because you have the right to do it. I think that's the natural progression of this discussion. But the next step I look at is understanding that just because we have weapons, just because we have means, just because we have right or permission to do some things, we always have to remember that our trust cannot be in these things. Right. And as much as I wish this was a separate discussion that didn't have to be had together, it is. Because so many people who feel strongly about this subject, the ones who get offended if you even say that there's a circumstance to not fight for your rights, or the ones who get offended if you say there is a circumstance to fight for your rights. This is a subject that it seems like most people fail to understand. And Psalm 44, 6-8 is the verses I want to give. It says, "For I will not trust in my bow, neither shall my sword save me. But thou hast saved us from our enemies, and hast put them to shame that hated us. In God we boast all the day long, and praise thy name forever, Selah." So for me, this is the passage that clear permission to have swords, clear permission to have. Sorry?
What was that reference? I'm sorry.
Psalm 44, 6-8. But there's clear permission here within Scripture to have these items of defense. The thing where they become a problem, the same way anything can become an idol at some point, or at these kind of issues, is when you put your trust in these things. It's kind of like this. It's not a sin to have a bank account with extra money in it, but I don't trust the bank account to take care of me. I trust God to provide. I look both ways when I cross the street, but my whole trust is that God's going to be the one who gets me from one side to the other, because if he doesn't grant me the next beat of my heart, then I don't care how many times I look, I'm not going to make it across that street. And I think that's the other issue at the heart of this idea of self-defense, especially when you start applying weapons into it, and whether, is it okay for a Christian to own a gun and so forth, is that I think you showed that biblically it would be hard to say no. I know plenty of people who still argue that because they'll take this verse and ignore the other verse. But that's why you have to put these things together and understand that there's a clear message. That's just like my thought on Matthew 5 is to really understand it. You need to look at it in the light of context of Scripture as a whole. And that's where you start to see what I was talking about is, okay, just because something is your right doesn't mean it's right to do. The same thing is true with this is anyone who wants to use this verse to say it's wrong to own a gun. No, he didn't say it's wrong to own a weapon. He said it's wrong to put your trust in the weapon. It's not wrong to have things. It's wrong to put your heart into those things in a way that's improper. And in this case, it's a matter of trusting something other than God. And I have several other verses I can give. So I'll throw them out there if you guys want. I'll go ahead and throw them out. Psalm 33:17 is a really good one. Psalm 33:17 says, "And horse is a vain thing for safety. Neither shall he deliver any by his great strength." David also says, I didn't write this one down, but in another psalm, David says that some trust in horses and some in chariots, but I will trust in the name of the Lord. Yeah. And then Proverbs 23:31 is one I like a whole lot, where it says, the horse is prepared for the day of battle, but safety is of the Lord. And so there's a clear painting being presented here. There's nothing wrong with you having the ability to defend your home. There are times where it is the proper thing. It is the best thing for you to do. There's times where you have to step back and consider, is this really going to bring about the greater good? But the main thing is always to remember to trust God, to trust his judgment in terms of when he fights for your cause, and to trust God in terms of his ability to protect you better than any weapon or anything else ever could. I think that's the main thing that we have to take away once we've established that it clearly is something we have the biblical right for.
I guess one thing I'd add on, you think you talking about that is, I agree, but it's just there again, something with the weapons, that's one of the keys that, man, it'd pretty much be impossible to say that it's wrong to have weapons in the Bible because it is accepted, expected, assumed at the very least. So that's one thing, for people that don't believe in having weapons at all. But then it just kind of gets my mind thinking again, just from a logical standpoint of like that. Obviously, if we don't have a lot about God saying you strictly can't defend yourself, or when you can or when you can't. There's some minutia there. But the point of the matter is, if it's accepted and expected we're going to have weapons, and not wrong to have weapons, then obviously. It's not just for hunting. It's in the context of those verses. It is for defense. But I'll digress from that because I'm just pretty much agreeing with what you said. One last thing I would throw out there that when it really comes down to it, for those that are pacifist, I don't agree with the pacifist position, but at the same time, I can accept somebody with a pacifist position, for whatever that's worth.
Well, it's like being a vegetarian. I have a right to eat meat, but if you choose to abstain, you're welcome to it. I mean, I'm not going to condemn you for that.
Yeah.
I think it's actually that's pretty much a 1-for-1 comparison on that.
Yeah.
In regards to what you say on the point of weapons, is absolutely David was a skilled swordsman. David used Goliath's sword. I mean, he went and got it and carried it, and he was a great warrior. So it's absolutely true that, I mean, the context of those is that he'll defend himself. Yeah, I'll go to war and I'll use my sword. I mean, just because he said he didn't trust the sword didn't mean he left it at home.
Right.
Because he didn't trust the bow didn't mean he left it setting on the shelf. He took the weapons with him. He just knew that at the end of the day, his skill with the sword wouldn't be what got him out of the battle or not. It's in the hand of God. But that didn't stop him from training. It didn't stop him from being a skilled warrior. But you think when he was a child, that was his mentality. That God, with his bare hands, allowed him to kill a bear and a lion. So he didn't need the armor of Saul. 5 smooth stones and a sling was enough for him. So I think absolutely I agree with you that the context is that he still carried them. He still had the weapons of war and had the things to defend himself. He just learned that the spiritual stance is to know that at the end of the day, real safety's in the hands of God. That I'm not trusting these things to take care of me. They're just tools.
And I would add insurance to the list of things you were mentioning as well.
Yeah, there's a huge
for the people who say, "Well, don't you trust God?" It's like, yeah, but I still have insurance. I mean, it doesn't mean you don't trust God.
I've met several that don't have any type of insurance outside of what the law requires.
Yeah,
because they're like, the Bible says, "My God shall supply all your needs."
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, even little things like that can get complicated when you really try to think about it.
Yeah.
But no, I think there's a huge list. Most anything that's debatable is, or you're not trusting God. Anything you've ever been asked, or you're not trusting God if you have this, probably fits in that list somehow, to some degree or another. All right, if you fellas are happy with that discussion so far, I'll keep things moving and I'll bring us over to the other thought, because I do think that this is where we transition from this idea of, okay, now we've established absolutely you have the right. Does it mean you should always do it? Well, not necessarily. There's a time and a place for everything. Then there's the big question about, okay, if God's telling us to consider the greater good and to suffer for righteousness, I think that's a good place to come into this idea. What does it mean to do good to those who do evil to you and heap coals upon their head? So I'm going to get Brother Kline then to answer that question. I'm going to go ahead and mute Brother Hailey. I'll introduce the question, and then I'll mute myself, the other Brother Hailey. But Brother Kline, I'll get you to answer the question. What does it mean to heap coals on someone's head?
All right. Well, I wanted to start because, as we were discussing, Brother Hailey, before we even came on here, there's a lot of different ideas of what heaping coals of fire actually means and things like that. And as I was studying through this, I wanted to start off in Matthew chapter 5 of all places, because that's what we've been discussing a lot. But beginning in verse number 43, he says, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same? And if ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect." And a lot of people get this idea that we should just be good to those who are like ourselves, those who are like us, those who are of our own. But the Bible is asking us the question, well, what do ye more than others? If you love them, what reward have ye? So it's showing us here that there is obviously a need not only to be good to fellow Christians, only to our friends, only to our family, but even in respect to our enemies. And I've found in experience with other people, and even things I've heard from celebrities and things like that, and politicians, that totally contradicts. In fact, one person said the idea that God says love your enemies devalues the idea of love, which honestly does not make sense in my view from a logical perspective, let alone a biblical perspective, because it actually shows just how great love is. You're willing to extend your love not only to your loved ones, not only to your friends, but even to those who hate you. And so getting back to our idea of heaping coals of fire, there's two passages where I found it mentioned, and one is in Proverbs chapter number 25. Let me turn there. Proverbs chapter 25. And it says, beginning of verse number 21, "If thine enemy be hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he be thirsty, give him water to drink. For thou shalt heap coals of fire upon his head, and the Lord shall reward thee." Now, Romans chapter 12, what we had been discussing previously, sort of goes a little bit more into depth about the idea of living peaceably with all men, as we talked about, and so forth. But no, I'm in 1 Corinthians, sorry about that. Romans chapter 12, he says, one more page. It says in verse number 17, recompense to no man evil for evil, provide things honest in the sight of all men, if it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. So already what we were talking about, the idea of avenging ourselves, it's all right, as you pointed out, to defend ourselves, but not necessarily to get the vengeance. But then he says in verse 20, therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. And again, as we were discussing, Brother Hailey, we talked about this idea of the interpretation. And some that I saw interpreted it as being a way of shaming your enemy, because you're showing him that, look at this good deed I've done. How dare you hate me? I guess would be the short answer. But from what I read, I found what I felt was a good sort of interpretation of what it's saying. It's the idea of heaping coals of fire is not to consume them, although it does, it could possibly bring shame to them because they realize this person that I hate so much is doing good to me. But it's not to consume them. Better it is to melt him to kindness, a metaphor taken from the idea of smelting metallic ores. And somebody had in fact written a poem about it. So artists melt the solent ore of lead while heaping coals of fire upon its head. In the kind warmth, the metal learns to glow, and pure from the dross, the silver runs below. So, the hope here is not to make them feel bad, because I know in the social media world that we live in, we have a tendency not to do good for good, but to do good to get them where it hurts, to show them, to make them feel bad. But from what I've read and what I've studied, it seems to indicate, no, the idea is to try to melt their heart to kindness, to show them that, through this is the example God is showing through me. And I want to show God's love to you through the example that I'm doing, not to get them back, but to say, trying to melt their heart to kindness, try to show them that you are someone who genuinely wants to love them, wants to care for them. And, hopefully they'll see a better perspective about you and about the things of God as a result. And one place that that I found was in 1 Samuel chapter 24 that illustrates that. Now, if you are familiar with this passage, it talks about, this was when, Saul was in the cave, and David went in and he cut a piece of his skirt off from his robe. And he had the opportunity to kill Saul. He had the opportunity. In fact, his men were hoping he would kill Saul, because Saul had caused so many evil things, had caused such inconvenience for David. But David, as famously said, I'm not gonna touch the Lord's anointed. He is my king. As long as God, as long as he is Lord over me, as long as he's master over me, I'm going to do what God wants to do. I'm going to do the right thing. And so in verse 16, now, of course, we know throughout the life of Saul, he never truly got to the point where he necessarily recompensed with David or reconciled with David. But it was a bit of an interesting moment, as we see here. Verse 16, he says, and it came to pass when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, is this thy voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And he said to David, thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded thee evil. And thou hast showed this day how that thou hast dwelt with me, for as much as when the Lord had delivered me into thine hand, thou killest me not. For if a man find his enemy, will he let him go well away? Wherefore, the Lord reward thee good, for thou hast done unto me this day. And now behold, I know well that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of the Lord of Israel shall be established in thine hand. Swear now therefore unto me by the Lord that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David sware unto Saul, and Saul went home. But David and his men gat them unto the hold. So, this is sort of a moment that Saul didn't understand, because by nature, nature tells us that if someone's done us wrong, We ought to do something wrong back to them. If we have the opportunity to hurt that person, we should hurt them. And David didn't do that. In fact, it tells us in verse, verse 4, and the men of David said unto him, behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thy hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. And it came to pass afterward that David's heart smote him because he had cut off Saul's skirt. And so just even doing that hurt him, and he smote his heart because of what he had done unto Saul. Even though he had the opportunity to kill him, it even hurt him to even cut off a piece of his skirt. And it might, in some ways, goes with what you said. Even if we have the right to do it, as Brother Hailey pointed out, even though we have the right to do it, everybody's saying, David, you can do this. You can kill him. You have the opportunity. Saul will be out of your hair. He'll no longer be a nuisance to you. He didn't do it because, he believed in what the word of God said about the Lord's anointed. He believed in that respect for the king. And as a result, he ended up, in some ways, if nothing else, causing the heart of Saul to question why he had been so evil to David. And so, that's really great, and I've seen examples of, there's a gentleman I know from Indiana County who is black. And in our area, there used to be Klan meetings, and he went and attended those meetings. And as a result of him showing his kindness to them, it was very hard for them to defend their hatred of him. And many of them ended up leaving the Klan. And as a result, he's now really good friends with them. And so instead of trying to hit them or cause distress for them, he showed them kindness. And that's what goes back to Romans chapter 12, where it says, be not overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. It can be so easy for us to feel so much hatred and frustration for those that hate us. And yet the Bible tells us, don't let it overcome you. Overcome it with good. And so in that respect, I think that's what it means to heap coals of fire, not even necessarily to shame them, although, if they truly have a conscience and have an open mind, they'll see, okay, what I'm doing, this hatred I have is stupid. But more so to show the goodness of God, show the power of God, and show, try to win them over, basically. And, it's a shame when people don't want to reconcile. They don't want to come back together. But by doing such things, I think we have a better chance, as they say, of winning more people with honey than vinegar. So from what I've studied, that is what I believe it talks about when it says heaping coals of fire upon someone's head. Someone.
I would agree that I believe that should be your goal. I think Peter 2:12 is a good verse for that. It says, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. I think that it's speaking to a very similar principle, this mindset that when I'm doing things, whatsoever you do it to the glory of God. So I think that has to be at least one side of how you see this. I do think if we look at Romans 12, I don't think we can do it out of pettiness. I don't think this should be our goal, but I do think there is a side to this, though, that, and this is something I just want to bring out in terms of the idea of putting coals upon somebody's head, is God, I believe, uses this illustration because it means what it literally says in this sense, that if I was to walk up behind and put a hot coal upon your head, I have put you in a situation where you cannot sit still. That you're in a situation where you have to respond in one way or another. I think that's why he uses that. And I think the goal we want, what we're trying to produce, is exactly what you're discussing. I do think there's a second half to this, though. And I think this is why you find that people have such varying degrees of what they believe the passage to mean, is because we always have a tendency to take the side that we feel most comfortable with and go one way or the other on it. And that's why I appreciate what you brought out, because I think you looked at it well. But I think you get some people who look at it like what you described in the beginning, this idea of almost like this petty mentality of like, I want to punish you. I'm going to show you I'm better than you. And so they read that out of this. And then you get the other side where, as you and I talked about, a preacher friend of ours, or at least he's a friend of mine. I didn't ask if he's your friend. You just knew who he was. But a preacher friend of mine who is a great preacher, and I have the utmost respect for him. I heard him preach on this, and his thought, he was so desperate to take all the bite out of it and any of the God exercising vengeance out of it, that he got criticized for what he made the passage to be, because he made it something it wasn't. Because as I shared, he was teaching this idea of carrying a basket on your head and people putting coals in the basket and all of this. Now, out of respect, I won't say who he was, because he preaches fantastic messages. This is just one time where I adamantly disagree on his interpretation of the passage. But for him, it's all about being a blessing to somebody. Just be a blessing to somebody. Keep the fire going is the idea he had. And I don't believe that's at all what's being presented here. I also don't believe at all it's this idea of like this petty, I'm going to show you I'm better than you mentality.
Right.
But note that this passage and most any other passage is about you simply doing that which is good and trusting God with the results.
Right.
So what I believe is essentially you're putting people in a position where you have done to the best of your ability. You've done what you can to point them to God. You have done something so that when they look at your life, there is no thing that they can use to dishonor God. You've done your best to point them to him, show them his love, his mercy, so forth. But the other layer to this that I want to peel back a little bit, since we're talking about layers on stuff tonight, is this idea that God does say that vengeance is his in the context of this. So it says, of course, you've read the passage. I'll read again just to set it up. Romans 12, verse 17, recompense to no man evil for evil, provide things honest in the sight of all men. So it is about this idea of having that honest conversation or lifestyle. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. So we've seen that's one of the big points tonight that everything we've discussed is kind of hinged upon. And so I really appreciate Brother Hailey drawing that emphasis there. And then verse 19 says, dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger. And that's why I say there is a therefore. So it does mean we have to look back to that. And so while I agree that the point of verse 19 is, or I'm sorry, verse 20 is everything you said. Therefore, if the enemy hungry, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. So everything that you were saying, the idea of provide all things honest in the sight of all men, and so forth. We see that there's this idea of pointing people to Christ through that, and so I agree completely with this idea of warming people up with to the love of God. That you have this thing, but what he's presenting is essentially two possibilities. That you put that coal in their head, and either they're going to sit there and try to take it until they just can't take it no more, or they're going to have to move. They're going to have to do something. You know, the same thing. If you'd rather not be on the head, if you sit on a coal, you're not going to sit there forever. You can try to hold it as long as you can, but eventually you have to be moved one way or another.
Right.
I believe that that's the heart of this, is that you've done what you can. You've put the coal there, not in a way to be mean, but to try to win them to good, to try to overcome evil with good. But if they refuse to be moved, then okay, you've given place to wrath. You've given a place to the vengeance of God. And that's why for me, I think it feels like it's such a should be cut and dry passage. That's why it's always strange when people just veer to one side or the other with it to me. But that aside, I'll give Brother Hailey his chance to see if there's anything left open for him to jump on.
Not really.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty well covered, but again, just agree and with both of you, since you're saying the same thing. But there is the two sides of it, and you don't have to go to one or the other extreme. But yeah, absolutely, I believe our motive has to be right in doing right. But it is, maybe try to put what you said in a smaller statement. I can still take. I don't know if comfort's the right word. There's a better word maybe I'll come up with, but basically that knowing knowing that God is going to deal with these people.
Mm-hmm.
God gives us that, and He's basically saying, "Look, I'm going to deal with this," and ultimately, our hearts need to be right. Going to the other side of it, saying, "Okay, God, these are terrible people, but bottom line, our battle's not with flesh and blood. They need to be saved." Blah blah blah. Our heart to be right, man. I hope they get things right. But regardless, also taking comfort in that God's going to do right, and that could involve that vengeance you talked about, God dealing with them. And so I can not feel like, that justice isn't going to be done, but I just need to trust God with that justice. And hopefully they'll plead for mercy and get that instead of the justice. And that needs to be my heart, but I still need to take comfort in, trusting God that He's wiser than me. And so that if He says He can deal with this better than me, I need to let Him deal with this better than me. And yes, that may include actually them having to pay a price. Mm-hmm. I totally agree with what you were both saying, but thought it was well said. Yeah, awakening I just put notes down about, I've always heard of the coals of hot fire, awakening the conscience, trying to get their attention, basically what you were saying, letting God work, judge, do whatever. And God's ultimate goal is always repentance. That's the only notes that I put down.
Even for the passage in Proverbs, you even have the other side in regards to God promising to reward you as well.
Right.
So there's a chief principle here of trusting God, that you do what's good, you do what you know to be good, and trust God. And that's not a principle you need to hear. I mean, Philippians chapter 4, I think, discusses that principle about those things which what you've been taught, do those things. That there's a principle throughout Scripture that we need to do that which is good and trust God to take care of the results. In terms of the unique thought to this that separates it from those other passages, I think it comes down to that simple thing of when someone is rendering evil unto us and we're doing good, every time you're doing good, you are essentially placing a coal on their head and you're putting them in a position where they have to respond. I think it's you see that with Saul. David put him in that.
That's a great illustration. That's a great picture of that.
Yeah, I think it's great because you also see this side of it that God did. I mean, it took longer than maybe we would have wanted, but God did eventually deal with Saul. Mm-hmm. God didn't just let it go unpunished. God, and we don't even know we know a lot, but we don't necessarily know everything that was going on between God and Saul in terms of how He worked in his heart and convicted. Right. It even reminds me, it's a different setup, but it reminds me a lot of the idea of what you see with Moses going to Pharaoh and God giving him chance after chance and him always responding with the negative. And eventually it put God in a situation where He had to reach out in vengeance. He had to punish. And essentially what He's teaching is that when we do good and people fail to respond positively, yes, that's going to invite God's wrath, his vengeance on them. But that's not necessarily our goal. I mean, it's not what we're trying to do. There is a comfort in that, and knowing that God will step up and defend us. He'll fight for us, and He'll do what's right. We just have to do our part of doing what's right. But I think the main goal, of course, is everything that you taught on, that the goal is to hopefully wake that person up and show them the same goodness that has been shown to us, that the goodness of God might lead them to repentance.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, you fellas got anything you want to bring further on either of these thoughts?
No, I don't think so. I think they were pretty well covered. I think it's the first time you've had to remind me of my time, interestingly enough.
I think so, but it was.
Yeah, but it's just that I was, I don't know, having a harder time just because it is tough. I don't know. It's
well, you were actually on your closing thought already.
Layers to it. It's not just a yes or no answer. I don't think.
Yeah, I think with the first question of is self-defense okay, there is clearly no yes or no answer because technically speaking, legally speaking, yes. Mm-hmm. Morally speaking, that's where there's no yes or no answer.
Right.
Not it is a question of it's a question of individual circumstance. If a man breaks into your home and he's going to kill your family, I think the answer is probably always going to be yes. Go defend your family. Is your government raining down wrath on you because they're against Christianity, and you can be a greater light by going to the persecution? Well, I think our Bible shows plenty of examples that the answer in that case is don't defend yourself. Turn the other cheek and take it. And so I think in terms of religious persecution, the answer is probably always going to be no. In terms of protecting your family, the answer is probably always going to be yes. I mean, I'm sure there's exceptions to these rules. That's why even there's not a cut and dry yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to be in tune enough with the Bible and the Holy Spirit to measure your individual circumstance. Sometimes you have to measure it fast.
Yeah.
So that's why I think the chief principle is to learn first to trust God to fight for your right and cause. Learn first to trust God over anything you have. And then when you do get pushed into those corners, you have to make those decisions. If you get those settled in your heart, it'll be a lot easier to make those decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my conviction on it, at least.
Yeah.
I don't own guns in Belgium. I had plenty of them in the States. Over here, you can legally own them, but the government looks at you as a criminal if you do. So they frequently come to your house to check and see if you have the gun locked up and meeting regulations. If you get pulled over and they notice that you are a gun owner, they automatically assume you are a criminal at the same time. This is what I've been taught by the Belgian people, at least. So it's a big headache. You have to do a lot. You have to jump through a lot of hoops to own a gun in Belgium. You can do it, but it's a lot of headache.
Sounds like California in the U.S. Probably worse over there, I'm sure.
Yeah, kind of. All right. Well, I told Brother Hailey we would keep it under an hour and a half. We certainly have managed that. I think we can start wrapping up, and we'll get it even as close as we can to less than that. So I'll go ahead and I'll give opportunity, Brother Kline, if you want to give any closing thoughts, I'll let you start closing us down.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a good discussion today. We talked about the idea of self-defense, and yeah, it is a bit of a complicated issue, especially when you consider, the circumstance. Again, it kind of goes with what the last time I was on here, and we talked about, I'm trying to remember what my subject, oh yeah, I believe it was about prayer, and about when God doesn't answer prayers or something like that, should we continue to pray? And our conclusion was basically, it depends. And so, and I guess in some ways that kind of goes with self-defense, is that it depends. It depends on the circumstance. It depends on what's going on. If we have the right, should we still do it? And, so yeah, I mean, it kind of does, it does seem a little complicated, and sometimes we're not always given the opportunity to think about it. But at the same time, it kind of goes back even to the principle of asking for God's help. Well, if we're already right with God, if we're living carnally and all of a sudden something comes up in our lives, we're not having a relationship with God. We find it to our hands and say, God, help us. If we're not prepared for that type of situation, it's not going to be as easy as if we'd already had a relationship with God in prayer and study and things like that. So when it comes to self-defense, if we don't have a biblical perspective from it already, then it becomes more difficult to make those decisions in those situations. And that can even go with the other discussion about heaping coals of fire on our enemy's head. That obviously has a lot to do with our motive, and not necessarily just doing it because I'm going to get them and make them feel sorry and make them feel ashamed. Paul talked about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 about I could speak wonders and heal the sick and all these other things. I can do all these wonderful things, and if I have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. I'm become nothing. And so in that same respect of doing overcoming evil with good. So I guess that would be my final thoughts.
That's why I put these two together, because I think the heart of both issues are going to come down to that statement of the greater good of trusting God and doing that which is right. Then, Brother Hailey, do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to bring out as well?
Well, I think just to emphasize that our battle's not with flesh and blood. To remember that, whether it's in self-defense and the heaping hot coals. And then, the other way that we're, they've been a good job putting these two together is just maybe to close with the emphasis or an emphasis on self-defense, like never involving words, or petty things. Going back to the idea of, beware, just because you may feel threatened and you may get adrenaline when someone is speaking to you in a certain way, it definitely doesn't warrant a physical response. And I think as a child of God, it definitely doesn't warrant even a equaled type of verbal response. I think there's a better way to come about it. And to me, those two kind of come together in that sense too, of keeping a difference between the two of them.
Oh, I appreciate it, because it's actually, now that you say that, if there's one place we probably could have spent a little more time talking about, that was certainly it. The importance of, as how Christ went as a sheep, dumb before the shears, and opened not his mouth. That, when we're suffering, we're going through things, that's definitely what a lot of the passage is talking about: trusting God to defend our right and cause, to shut the mouth of enemies, and so forth. Maintaining our integrity. I mean, most of those passages, I wouldn't say all necessarily, but most of those passages are dealing with the fact of being silent and suffering. In fact, I preached a whole message on how one of Christ's great examples of what it really means one of the greatest examples of manliness you'll ever see is Christ opening not his mouth, when his words are literally what spoke the universe into existence. And at any moment he could open his mouth and stopped it one way or another. But to take it knowing that he was willing to suffer for the greater good. I think for us, it brings even that idea, that other side of it, that we're not necessarily always doing it for the greater good. We're doing it because in our integrity, we're going to trust God to fight those battles. And I do think that brings us back to kind of where we started in a lot of this, with the idea that in order for us to really accept what the Bible says, we first have to put away our pride. That was one of the first issues we talked about. So it's a good place to kind of loop back, is that one of the reasons we feel so strong. And I say this speaking as someone who was the school bully, who loved to fight, who loves boxing and all those things for the sport of it. I mean, it's hard to not defend yourself, but it's something that over time, the more you mature in Christ, he helps you to trust him more and more with it. And I do think that's why I guess one of the hard issues we always come back to is learning to trust God with the calls. All right. Well, I appreciate you fellas having joined. I hope I didn't negate your closing statement by saying I was agreeing with you. But anyways, I appreciate you fellas having joined me today. We've succeeded in keeping it well under the hour and a half mark. So I'm not going to draw it out any longer. I'm going to ask for everyone who is still watching with us, if you made it this long, leave us an amen in the comments. But I do appreciate everyone having been a part of it, who stayed for the discussion. If you have further questions, you're welcome to send them to me or one of these fellas. Most importantly is, if you're watching this and you don't know that you have assurance of salvation, you don't know if you were to die, you'd go to heaven, then please make sure you talk to one of us. Let us show you from the Bible how you can be saved. Let us answer that. It's a far more important question than whether or not you can fight somebody just because they want to fight you. It's far more important that you know where you're going to go when this life is over. So please do, if you're not sure of that, talk to one of us and let us have an opportunity to share the gospel with you further. Again, I appreciate everyone who's joined, everyone who watched this later as well. I appreciate that. So we're going to go ahead and close. I'll close out the live stream. Thank you again.